Okay, so that was what happened the first time we loaded the page. But then we submitted the form. So let's take a look at what happens when we did that. So again, the first thing that happens is the build page function gets called. We go up to build page. It loops through the various elements. It builds our HTML header first, and then it loops through again. And then we have our contact form, and it runs the build form function for that. So then we go to build form, which is at the very top. And again, we set the form number and a default output variable. And then we check to see if there's an action element that got submitted, which it has. And it checks to see if the value is submit_1, which is the value because there was only one form, and the form number was 1 for that. So because this passes, then we're going to run if validate form, and we're going to pass it the elements. So let's take a look at validate form. We'll scroll down. Here's validate form. It gets past all of the elements that got passed to the build form function, and it's going to loop through them in a very similar way. It's going to grab the name as well as the settings for that element. It's going to look at the post values from the form and check out the value, because that's what we're going to validate against. And then we're going to check to see if the validation setting exists for this element. So if we scroll down and look at the form array here, you'll see the validations attribute set here. For name, it's set to not empty. For email, it's set to not empty and is valid email. And then for comment, it's set to not empty. So if we go back up to validate form, the first time it loops through this, it's going to be for the name, which has a validation of not empty. So it checks to see if there's any validations. There are. And then it loops through each one of the items, and then it switches based on the value of that. So this one has a case of not empty. So first we take the value that we got from the post variables. We trim it to make sure that any white space is eliminated outside of the value, and we check to see if it equals an empty string. If it does, we're going to return false, which is basically going to say that this form does not validate. We're not going to do anything fancy here like setting errors for particular inputs, or even giving any feedback about what didn't validate. And that's just to keep this example simple. So that finishes the loop for the name element. Next is the email element, which has 2 validations. So it goes through each of the validations. The first loop switches based on the value, and it's not empty again. So we're going to check to see if it's not empty. And if it passes that, then it's going to loop through again. And this time the validation is called isValidEmail. So we're going to end up running this case. And the logic here just checks for an @ symbol in the text of the email, which definitely isn't super robust, but it will serve as a decent example for validation. If it doesn't have the @ symbol, it's going to return false and break us out of this loop. But if it does, then we'll loop through again for the comments, and the comments element only has the validation not empty. So we'll check to see if that's not empty. If that passes, then this will break out of all of these loops and return true. So if we go back to the validate form line here, if that passes, that is nothing returns false, then we're going to submit the form. If it did submit false, then we're just going to skip over that and rebuild the form. So that's why we didn't see anything special happening when we submitted the form and it wasn't valid. But that second time we submitted the form and we put in all of the right elements, then it ran submit form. So let's take a look at what submit form does. We'll scroll down. Okay, so submit form takes all of the same elements that validate form and build form did. We initialize the output variable, and then we loop through each one of the elements. We grab the value, just like we did for the validate form function, by grabbing it from post and passing it the name as the key, and then we just add the value to an HTML list. We grab the title from the settings variable, and we grab the value, and we just wrap that in list item tags. Finally, we wrap some HTML around those list items and add the text you submitted the following, and then we add the unordered list tags around it, and then we print that to the page. Now again, this isn't really robust code in any form, but this code has enough moving pieces so that it gives us something that we can evaluate in terms of restructuring the code in an object-oriented programming way.